Welcome to episode 28 of the Eyes on Privacy podcast. This month, since we're doing it on a monthly basis now, I'm joined by Keith Watson. I'm Preston Wiley. Josh Gillum is busy with work, I guess, tonight, so he was not able to join us. But Keith is going to introduce our topic for this month.
All right. So what we want to talk about is I don't know if I'd call it a service, but something that China is using called the Great Cannon, which is somewhat related to the Great Firewall of China. But the Great Cannon is more of a distributed denial of service attack tool. And it really takes advantage of using multiple clients, hundreds or thousands of clients out on the internet, just anybody's web browser, in fact, to launch distributed denial of service attacks. And basically there are two interesting ones. The first was an attack on a site called greatfire.org. That occurred on March 16th. And then on the 26th of March, GitHub was also targeted in this. And these basically knocked these sites offline. And it's believed that the reason that GitHub was attacked because it was hosting some code that helped circumvent part of the Great Firewall of China. And so what's interesting about this is we talk about the Chinese firewall, and it's really about censorship. They want to be able to block information out on the open internet. And they do this not as you would in a traditional firewall where you have a device that sits in between your source and destination, but this is actually tapping into the locations of Chinese citizens within China and monitoring what they're looking for. And if it triggers on some keyword or some site, in a normal firewall setting, it would actually block that connection. But in this case, what the Chinese firewall does is it sends a TCP reset packet. And basically that tears down the connection that's been established, basically affecting the Chinese user from accessing a site. What's interesting is that the Citizen Lab, which is a research organization, basically did some research on how this distributed denial of service attacks were working, and it works very similarly to and possibly the same infrastructure or architecture that the Great Firewall uses. And so the cannon basically is injecting code into web requests, specifically from the Baidu servers, and passing HTML or passing JavaScript code, I believe, that would basically use the web browser of the person browsing the Baidu server site, and then use that to basically make a series of connections off to whatever the target server was, in this case being the greatfire.org site and then later the GitHub site. And so basically users were unwittingly participating in distributed denial of service attacks against these sites. And basically you wouldn't really see that. And even if they made only a few connections every second, when you have several thousand desktops doing it all at once, that's obviously going to create a lot of load on these sites and bring them down. So that's basically the technical side of it. There's a lot more detail about how it all works. But I really wanted to point this out as a kind of a state-sponsored distributed denial of service attack tool. Previously, we've seen a lot of distributed denial of service attacks that might be driven by hacktivists or people that want to just bring down sites. There's a whole business now that has built up around just the controlling distributed denial of service attacks, and for a reasonable amount of money, you can take down very large sites by harvesting a botnet and using basically those servers to launch your attack, and you can scale that up, and it's a reasonable amount of money to do that. And so there's services online. It's fairly well automated, but that's all the dark arts, if you will, These are independent organizations, independent people running these types of attack tools. In this case, we're talking about China. And so that's kind of the new and interesting factor here. They're also targeting a very popular site, GitHub, for programmers, where a lot of source code is shared. And what's interesting is that GitHub has been blocked before, but mostly the Chinese withdrew that block at some point because they use it too. And so a lot of Chinese programmers were getting access to a lot of code on GitHub as well. So it's kind of interesting that it's being attacked this time as well. So thought we'd start that off as our discussion, but that's kind of where we are.
Well, I mean, the first thing that I guess I can say about this is this whole injecting JavaScript code is not necessarily a new technique,
No.
from my understanding. I mean, I think ISPs do it sometimes to put, inject things into your web traffic so they can show pop-up windows and things like that. I seem to recall that Comcast was doing that at one point to kind of warn you that, you had been spotted sharing illegal files or something like that, and to warn you to not do it. They would inject essentially a pop-up window into your web traffic to tell you things. So this isn't necessarily a new technique, but the way it was being used to do a distributed denial of service attack is kind of the new component, plus the being state sponsored as well.
Right. And they try to hide, I should say that while the attribution is believed to be China, what a lot of the sites that were, or a lot of the systems that were attacking were not in the China domain, the top level domain. So if you look at the Citizen Lab report, there's an indication that a lot of the hosts came from Taiwan and Hong Kong, even the US, Malaysia, Australia. Very few were actually based in China's top level domain. So that's also interesting. But a lot of those top level domains, Chinese is the one of the languages there, or in the case of the US, we have a lot of Chinese citizens here, and they're basically accessing Baidu, which is very popular e-commerce system over in China, and by doing that, they're getting this JavaScript injected. So
yeah, the way it worked, from my understanding, the way it worked was you had to actually go through the Chinese firewall, or what the Chinese perimeter, in order for it to work. So it was external entities that were outside of China that had to go through their perimeter to get to this ad service, which I think is what Baidu was serving ads in order to essentially get this JavaScript code in it. And the JavaScript code wasn't presented every single time too. It seemed to be kind of on a semi-random frequency as well. So it was. Yeah,
it wasn't every connection made. It was a small percentage, but even a small percentage was enough to have enough hosts to cause this distributed denial of service attack. I assume there's some knob they could tweak and say, "Hey, we're doing 5% now. Let's crank it up to 10%."
Right. So and then the choice of using a very popular, essentially a Google, the Google of China is what I've seen it called, the Google of China, was an interesting technique too, because it was argued that it could kind of erode trust in that service, and it could actually hurt China economically to choose them to choose this way to do their attack. So it's like the NSA saying we spy on you through your U.S. properties didn't have the best economic impact on U.S. businesses when that was revealed.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because they're trying to hide, kinda. They're using a commercial organization, Baidu in this case, as kind of the I don't know what you'd call it. It's the place that people want to go to, And by going to that site, and they didn't inject that JavaScript code in there and attack others. So it's very interesting if they're trying to hide who originated this. But the Citizen Lab guys were able to do fairly simple testing and reveal that that's how it worked. So if they're hiding, they're not doing a very good job of it.
Yeah, I mean that's pretty much the conclusion I got as well. They're not really trying to hide, but they did. I mean, they did seem to pick. They only seem to use some fairly. Most of the addresses were from Taiwan or Hong Kong. There were a few from U.S. And other areas, but a vast majority were from Taiwan and Hong Kong, which kind of somewhat implies that they may do some IP filtering as well, which maybe they thought would hide it a little bit better. Because I'm sure if they started hitting U.S. targets significantly, then it would be noticed fairly quickly, I'm guessing.
Right. So it'll be interesting to see if we see the cannon rolled out again and fired up. It'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, I mean, there was it was interesting that the way they did it with injecting JavaScript, and I think we've talked about it before, but there's been not state sponsored, but there's been malware served just via ad networks before as well. So,
but not in this way.
Not in this way, but ads have proven to be a vector of attack for just malware in general.
Yeah, typically malware's the method that they're using. So this is, I won't say a whole new ball game here, but it's definitely a way to harness quite a few systems and to do your bidding. And it looks like your bidding is not going to be popular. Yeah,
I don't know if there's ever been denial of service attacks done via ad networks before. I mean, this is obviously different. The ad network said they didn't do it. I guess we can't prove they didn't do it, but they said they weren't.
Well, we could prove it because not every request had JavaScript injected into it.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
So they could test, and that's how they knew the percentage of X number of connections made. We know that this percentage were injected, and the rest were normal traffic. So there is fairly good evidence.
Yeah, and based on their analysis, that's true. And based on their analysis, it is fairly certain that it was a Chinese, the Chinese government, and it was even probably hosted or it sat alongside the Great Firewall, which, based on some analysis that they had done on IP addresses and things like that, and just the way they worked, it seemed that like the code was somehow shared between the two, and there's a lot of evidence, but you're never gonna be 100% certain about things, so there's still a slight bit of speculation on their part.
Right. And because of the way the Great Cannon and the Great Firewall work, there's quite a few additional dangerous stuff that the Chinese government could do, because they have the ability to inject JavaScript in web connections. But what else can they do? Can they also inject malware into email connections? And this was something noted in the Citizen Lab report. This is just the start of what they can do. They have the infrastructure in place, and by changing how they use it, they could be causing even greater harm to some of the endpoints, not just targeted servers on the network as well.
Yeah, and I think we've mentioned this before as well, but I mean, they can do this to straight up HTTP traffic, but they cannot do this to HTTPS traffic. So if you use HTTPS to connect to things, then they can't do this. Although I believe they do have control of some certificate authorities, and they could technically forge certificates and act as a kind of a proxy and do things. So
true, and even Google noticed a little bit of nasty stuff going on with their own certificates from an intermediate CA, I believe, that that was issued by the Chinese registrar. So, yeah.
So yeah, I'm guessing that isn't out of the realm of possibility either. And if you were going to especially if you were going to be in China and wanted to access sites that you probably shouldn't be accessing, you probably want to take a careful look at your certificate authorities and probably unauthorize all of them except the ones you know you're going to need. Right. And especially ones that are based in China.
Right, and some of the latest versions of Chrome and Firefox provide some certificate pinning as well. So they've got some hard-coded capability into them to kind of detect when certificates are being misused. It's not foolproof. There's some problems, but for some key sites, that might be a protection built in that will provide some additional help. So I don't know too many technical details on it, but if you look at certificate pinning, that's some relatively new capabilities in the browsers. So hopefully
I have not
limit where you'd see this.
I have not looked at that, but I will take a look at that. So I don't know if I know Google took out that certificate authority that was used to fake the Google, make a bad Google certificate, but I'm not sure if they put it back. They said they were going to put it back after they essentially cleaned up their act or whatever.
Right.
So they took it out specifically to block that certificate. And once they were, I guess, assured that that certificate didn't exist and wasn't used anymore, they were going to put it back. Simply because
there was some period of time, I think they put them in timeout.
Okay, yeah. So that's basically what happened with that. They got that was their warning, I think. So
yep. So I guess the question for listeners would be, how do I prevent my system from being part of this? And I think since this was injected JavaScript, some mitigation can be done by if you're a Firefox user with no script, which basically controls what JavaScript can run and which can't. But the problem there is it looks like the JavaScript comes from Baidu. So if you trust Baidu and all its scripts, you're probably going to be you're going to be taking the injected code because it's going to look like it came from Baidu. So that may not be a complete solution there. So just keep that in mind. But it's generally a good idea to have some control over JavaScript in your browsers and Flash and all the other things. And NoScript is a good way to kind of get a handle on that. It's not the easiest thing to use if you're not familiar. And there are some times when I allow a lot of scripts and the sites still don't work. But I'd rather have that than harmful stuff going on.
I use AdBlock Plus, which will block most advertisements, but again, they let some through who say if you nice and follow their guidelines for ads, then they will let you through.
Yep.
But they seem to block. I haven't had any issues with it yet. So That's not true. I have had a few, but mostly it was blocking traffic that it probably shouldn't have blocked. But
right. HTTPS everywhere.
Yeah, that's
also a good plugin. That's available from the EFF.org, and that basically takes any HTTP connection and changes it to an HTTPS connection if that site supports it, and it kind of does it automatically, which is nice because sometimes you forget or you're not aware that they have an HTTPS version of the site available. So it's a good tool to kind of redirect you and keep you on those secure connections. That's another good tool to use as well.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like state-sponsored malware is going to be it's not an easy thing to avoid, I guess. So,
yeah, those are, as we've seen in the example of basically the NSA targeting Iran's nuclear capability. There's a way to build a very specific set of malware. So if they're after you, if you're targeted, yeah, there's not a lot you can do.
Yeah. So
Hopefully they don't target everybody, right? But who knows? Down the road, it's kind of hard to see where we're going to go.
Right. So interesting stuff. All right. So anything else to talk about on this topic? Any last thoughts?
I guess don't anger China.
Yeah.
Your site, no, that's not obviously great advice, but we'll see how. I mean, the U.S. government's reaction has been minimal, if any. I think I saw an open FBI report that said it happened. Thanks. That doesn't really help us. So, and their recommendations in there were pretty weak. So,
yeah.
Thanks. Thanks for no thanks.
I don't think you want to anger the NSA either. So.
Well, no.
Anyway, all right. Well, I guess I'll wrap it up then. Thank you to Keith Watson. I'm Preston Wiley, and keep your eyes on privacy.